How are you? It's Mr. Bascom. I'm looking at the SEQ rubric for the US History Regents Exam, and I just kind of wanted to go through the best way to put together one of the short essays. You can see here a score of 5 involves thoroughly developing both aspects of the task, which means you're really giving a lot of historic context, which means bringing up that outside information. You don't want to overdo it because you need to finish these essays in a relatively short period of time, but you clearly want to know that you have some background knowledge. The second bullet point involves comparing the two documents. Somewhere at the end of that first paragraph, you want it to be clear which of the choices you made, and that might be cause and effect, that might be similarity difference, and that might be turning point. Cause and effect means you're talking about how these two documents examine both the cause or reason for an event taking place and the effect, what changed as a result of that event. Similarity and difference, where you really want to analyze how these documents are clearly showing major differences and similarities between each other in dealing with the event or concept. And then turning point, where you want to talk about how both of these documents deal with an issue and how life was dramatically different as a result of that event discussed in the document. The goal is to make sure that you're really explaining or analyzing your thought process. You don't want to just write down, this is what the document says, because that's just being descriptive. Analysis really means explaining thoroughly what this means. And not just restating, but explaining. You want to use examples from the documents they give you. They're giving you two documents. You want to clearly not just cite, but in quotation marks, use the documents and then explain them. They want to see it. You want to see the quotation marks. They want to see in document 1 or in document 2 it says, and then your analysis comes in when you're explaining how those documents show a cause or effect, how those documents show a clear similarity or difference, or how those documents clearly show a turning point. Now again, the essay is asking the writer to develop all aspects of the task. There's 2 bullet points, one of which is the historic context, and the second one is comparing the documents. You want to make sure that somewhere in that first paragraph, again, that you are clearly showing which of those relationship choices you're picking. Are you picking similarity difference? Are you picking cause effect? Or are you picking turning point? Personally, I think the easiest one is similarity difference, where you can clearly show the similarities and the differences. And in a case like this, it's really obvious, but you're free to pick any of them. Outside information, this is where you're showing your knowledge base beyond these documents. Anything you know outside of these documents that relates to these documents, that's outside information. And then finally, it says support the task with relevant facts and examples. This is where you clearly want to use evidence directly from the documents provided to you. Not from other lessons in the past, not from things you recall and you remember. That's great for the outside information, but you need to make sure you're using the documents they gave you. You do not need an introduction or a conclusion for this short essay. For the civic literacy essay, you will, but not for this one. All right, these were the 2 documents you had to analyze the other day. Both of them deal with the Great Depression. And the first document looks at Herbert Hoover and his excerpt of a speech he gave concerning how he wanted to deal with the Great Depression. Now, if you have the background knowledge, you know that he was a laissez-faire president, that he felt that it wasn't the government's role to get overly active and involved, that people had to take care of themselves and try to do the best they could in dealing with issues rather than the government intervening. So as we're looking here, you're going to see me close read really quickly. It says this is not an issue as to whether the people are going hungry or cold. It's solely a question as to the best method by which hunger and cold can be prevented. I'm going to want to use parts of this when I get to the essay. It's a question as to whether the American people on one hand will maintain the spirit of charity and mutual self-help through voluntary giving, and the responsibility of local government as distinguished, on the other hand, from appropriations out of the federal treasury for such purposes. My own conviction is strongly that if we break down this sense of responsibility of individual generosity to individual and mutual help in the self and mutual self-help in the country of times of national difficulty, and if we start appropriations of this character, we have not only impaired something infinitely invaluable in the life of the American people, but have struck at the roots of self-government. Once this happens, it is not the cost of a few score millions, but we are faced with the abyss of reliance in the future upon government charity in some form or order. The money involved is indeed the least of the costs to American ideals and American institutions. So this really reflects his laissez-faire attitude. He's worried that if the government steps in, that it's going to take away from people's ability to do for themselves. So he feels like this would strike at the roots of self-government. All right. That if we break down this sense of responsibility, so right now I see 1, 2, 3 items I would want to use from this document for the essay. For this document, this is from Franklin Roosevelt. We know from our prior knowledge that he was a lot more progressive and wanted the government to take a much larger role in regulating and intervening to help stop this economic crisis. And we see here examples of that right away. We see, more important, a host of unemployed citizens face the grim existence of, and an equally great number toil with little return. Only a foolish optimist can deny the dark realities of the moment. So first, he is definitely bringing up how difficult this is. And then he says, our primary task is to put people to work. I think that's going to be really important, something we'll use. This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously. It can be accomplished in part by direct recruiting by the government itself. So he's talking right here about the government being involved. Treating the task as we would treat the emergency of a war, but at the same time, through this employment, accomplishing greatly needed projects to stimulate and reorganize the use of our natural resources. So he's clearly talking about the government being involved. And to me, the main parts I would use here is this part and this part that I highlighted. That's going to come into use when I write this essay. All right, this is me narrating as I'm writing the document. So you see me, I'm writing in blue ink. You should be writing in blue or black. You want to move rather quickly. Now, obviously, I sped this up quite a bit, but my first paragraph is filled with outside information where I'm briefly describing how the Great Depression began, when it began. I give a little bit of information about Black Thursday, and I start talking about how this led to a chain of events that would go on to be known as the Great Depression. But right here at the end of this first paragraph, you're going to see me start writing about how both Presidents Hoover and Roosevelt wanted this to end, but there were some clear differences. And this lets the reader know that we're going to be focusing on similarities and difference. That's got to be evident in that first paragraph. And you see me putting that in right here, where it says they both tried to deal with it in different ways. You want that evidence. My second paragraph, I'm starting here, focuses now on President Hoover's action, the first document. And it starts very simply by saying he's a laissez-faire president, which is prior knowledge, which will help you with the first bullet point. But then I clearly get into document 1 where I'm quoting an element of it. And you see I have my notes there, so I can write down in quotation marks clearly what he says and how that indicates that he is a laissez-faire president and he does not want the government being overly active. And that's what I'm adding to the paragraph here. By the way, if you make a mistake when writing with pen, please just cross out the word and keep writing. Don't waste time with whiteout or starting all over. That's the worst things that you can do here because time is very valuable. It's not our friend, as I often say in class, and you got to keep it moving. You don't have time for it to look perfect. It's not art class. But again, right now in my writing, and you can't see it all here, unfortunately, but I'm clearly using elements of the document and then explaining what that means, how it shows his attitude. Now I'm starting the third paragraph, which focuses on President Roosevelt. And here we see that I'm starting off by saying that his attitude is different. So again, letting the reader know that I'm focused on differences rather than some of the other relationships. And again, here in quotation marks, it uses examples from the document to show his point of view, his way of dealing with this. And the writing goes on to examine and state how he wants to deal with this and how he feels the federal government has to be more involved. He calls direct recruiting by the government, which means he actively wants the government to get involved in helping to solve this problem. and it's a clear difference between he and Hoover. I close out this paragraph by stating once again that they both want to solve the problem of the Great Depression, but they have very different attitudes concerning how they want to take that on. And I think that's really important to let the reader know how you feel. Okay, I hope this helped. I really want every one of my students to not just pass the Regents, but do well on it. Please make sure you're using the active documents and explaining them as clearly as you can, along with bringing that outside knowledge.